Although the Royal Navy had been upping its construction of sloops and destroyers, as well as ordering the first of many, many corvettes, the start of the Second World War still left the UK critically short of escorts for the various convoys that were now needed to try and guard against U-boats. Thus, as the war's first anniversary approached, and with the French destroyer and escort force removed from the equation by France's surrender, things were looking pretty bleak. The only nation with a significant force who might have some small warships going spare was the USA, and internal politics over there meant direct assistance was, for the moment, off the table. In August 1940, though, Churchill and Roosevelt managed to thread the needle of that particular issue. The British warned that if the UK had to surrender, then its various colonial possessions, including a slew of islands very close to the US mainland, would of course fall into German hands. This could be argued by the White House to move the war from a distant distraction to a potential threat to US national security. And so the Destroyers for Bases agreement was drawn up and signed. In exchange for handing over a 99-year lease on a number of British bases, which included most of those whose proximity to the US could cause problems if they fell into other hands, the British would receive 50 destroyers that were declared not vital to US needs to help the war effort. These ships were all old four-stacker flush-deck destroyers, the majority of them being Wickes class, most of the rest being Clemsons, and 3 being from the small and oft-forgotten Cadwell class, the immediate predecessor to the Wickes and Clemson classes. The Cadwells were also flush-deckers, but some had 4 funnels and others 3 with their central funnel made a bit larger. The US wasn't being any more generous than it had to be, though. It was currently reactivating a lot of the 4-stacker fleet for its own uses, and so many of them sent for British service tended to be the ones the US Navy wasn't really too keen on given their state after years and years of being in mothballs. This would cause some issues over in the UK in terms of actually getting them into service, and additionally various elements of their design, ones that optimised them for high-speed battle line and fast attack roles, actually made the ship somewhat less than ideal for anti-submarine warfare. However, it was better to have a bunch of suboptimal ships than none at all, and so the whole collection would promptly rename the Town class by the Royal Navy, as the ship's new names were all various smaller towns in the UK, which of course confusingly meant that there were now 2 Town class in service at the same time, but at least the Town class cruisers could use the subclass designations to distinguish themselves, like Southampton or Edinburgh. The ships would undergo significant alterations for their new role, most of them seeing much of their main gun and torpedo armament being removed, partly to improve stability in the Atlantic and partly to free up weight and deck space for more anti-submarine weapons, primarily lots and lots of depth charges. 6 vessels were sent directly to the Royal Canadian Navy, with the rest going to the Royal Navy at first. However, over the course of the war, some would also see service with the Free Dutch and Free Norwegian navies, a few more would be reallocated again from the Royal Navy to Canada, and a few would even be sent to bolster Soviet naval forces escorting the Arctic convoys in the closing days of the war. Although being sent into the teeth of the Kriegsmarine's U-boat offensive, only 7 ships were actually sunk by U-boats over the course of the war, and as more specialised escort ships began arriving in large numbers, the towns were phased out of this role and put into a wide variety of others. Some became training ships, others were used as various harbour vessels, some, as mentioned, were released to other navies, a few were used briefly on high-speed escort missions where their destroyer origins gave them the speed that was required to keep up, others were moved to coastal convoys, or they were placed in reserve, and a select few would be used for more involved tasks. HMS Campbelltown was famously expended to deny the Germans the use of the massive Saint-Nazaire dry dock by being converted into a giant floating bomb and then slightly remodeled to try and look vaguely like a German destroyer. Several ships were converted into target vessels for various schools, including, ironically, one that was used to help Royal Navy submarines in tracking and destroying enemy warships on the surface, but others were used for air crews learning to attack fast targets at sea, and so on and so forth. One ship even had 5 separate terms of service with 4 different navies, Starting life as the Wickes-class USS Twiggs, she became HMS Leamington, then HMCS Leamington, and then the Soviet Zuguchi, and was finally returned to the UK in 1950, where she was briefly used as the star of the film Gift Horse, which featured a young Richard Attenborough before his stint as a dinosaur necromancer. This ship played the fictional HMS Ballantrae, undertaking a one-way mission against Nazi-held France, which was heavily inspired by the Saint-Nazaire raid and HMS Campbelltown, which was understandably unavailable for filming, with the target changed in the film to a submarine base. With their utility as frontline units already having been mostly exhausted before the war had even ended, almost all the surviving ships were scrapped as soon as a spot in the breaker's yard was available in the post-war environment, the longest-lasting ships being those that had been lent to the Soviet Navy, which just weren't returned until the end of the 1940s and in some cases the early 1950s, which of course postponed their fates until then. The remains of HMS Ludlow, used as a target by the RAF at the end of the war, can just about still be seen at low tide off Yellow Craig Beach in Scotland.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.